Hello, hello. Today I want to show you how I make fette biscottate with a barley swirl at home. Known as rusks in English-speaking countries, these were a breakfast staple for me when I would visit my family in Italy as a child. I'm not going to pretend that this is a quick and simple recipe, but if you're a hardcore nostalgia sufferer like me who loves to bake, the time and effort is worth it. The base recipe I use comes from Valentina Boccia's website Ho Voglia di Dolce, which I adapted for use with dry yeast and added in the barley swirl. I highly recommend her website and her book if you read Italian recipes, and we'll link them down below. You're going to be needing a few special things for this recipe, including a kitchen scale. If you don't have one of these already, I do not know what you're waiting for because they are easy to use, they're not that expensive, and they open up an entire world of recipes. You don't need to waste your time on Google trying to convert weights into volumes. Next is a 12 by 4.5 inch loaf pan. This is a bit longer than we're used to in the States, but you can easily find these online for cheap. Unfortunately, I don't know how to convert this recipe to any other loaf pan size, so this is the one I'm going to be sticking with. You're also going to be needing instant roasted barley. This is drunk in Italy and in other countries as a coffee substitute, but it never really caught on in the United States, so you're going to have to find it online. It doesn't really matter which brand. I happen to like this one, but what does matter is that it's the instant kind. Be very careful to find that one. It tastes very pleasant and mild, kind of chocolatey or coffee-like, not gross at all. This dough begins with a starter for which you'll need only 4 ingredients, starting with 280 milliliters of warmed milk. Now, listen very carefully. You are not going to be using the entire 280 milliliters for the starter. You're only going to measure out 100 grams because the rest will go in the dough, but this is the most efficient way to measure it first. You only want the milk slightly warm to activate the yeast, not kill it, so about 112 degrees Fahrenheit. Next, you'll need 4 grams of active dry yeast. I don't worry about having to let it bloom for 10 minutes beforehand. It works either way. Then 1 teaspoon of honey, and lastly, 100 grams of all-purpose or 00 flour. I'm going to be measuring these ingredients directly into the bowl of my stand mixer, which is optional. I've made this recipe plenty of times without a stand mixer. You'll be fine. So again, very carefully, 100 grams of milk, not the entire 280 milliliters. You will save the rest of that for the rest of the dough later. Now for the yeast, very carefully measuring those 4 grams with a spoon. Now for the honey, about a teaspoon. I'm just going to measure it by eye. I got this little honey pot a couple years ago at Trader Joe's, and I've wanted one like this forever, and I just love it so much. It's very cute. In goes that honey to help feed the yeast. And finally, that 100 grams of flour. Once all the ingredients are in, I give it all a nice mix until everything is incorporated before covering it loosely with a cotton kitchen towel and placing it in a lit oven for about an hour, or until it looks bubbly and puffy like this. Now it's time to add the ingredients for the second phase of the dough. I'm bringing out my kitchen scale again and measuring out at least 450 grams of flour. I usually need to add a couple more spoonfuls as it's mixing, so keep your flour close by. Next, 80 grams of granulated sugar, followed by the remainder of the milk, which I've kept at room temperature. And lastly, 1 lightly beaten egg. I'm going to mix this together just a bit with a spatula to give my stand mixer a head start before attaching the dough hook and letting this mixture knead together for 5 minutes. I'm using a moderate speed here, number 2 on my stand mixer, and while it starts out as a sticky, kind of dry mess, it eventually comes together. Keep an eye out at this stage for whether or not you need to add more flour. You want it to eventually be able to pull away from the bowl while still feeling a bit sticky. It should also be wrapped somewhat compactly around the hook at this point. Now I'm going to turn off my mixer and release the dough from the hook before adding about 1 teaspoon of salt. Next, I'm going to add 80 grams of cubed softened butter, 1 cube at a time, with my mixer turned back on to that same speed as before. You'll see here that my butter wasn't perfectly soft, so I have to help it stay in the bowl, but eventually it incorporates. Knead this dough for about 12 minutes. Again, it starts out looking like a buttery mess before transforming into a soft, elastic dough that pulls away from the sides of the bowl and wraps around the hook. Stopping the mixer and releasing the dough from the hook again, I'm now dividing the dough into two roughly equal pieces. If one seems to you to be larger than the other, keep that larger one in the stand mixer and start kneading it again at the same setting. On an ample wooden surface, I'm stretching out the smaller piece a bit and sprinkling on about 1 tablespoon of instant barley. It's going to take a couple minutes for it to hydrate and mix into the dough, but in my experience, it's faster and more efficient to do this by hand than in the mixer. When I feel it somewhat dissolving into the dough, I'll flatten the dough again, add another tablespoon of barley, and keep kneading. Have some patience. It takes me about 5 minutes to mix it sufficiently into the dough. It doesn't have to be perfect, a few streaks here and there are fine, but it should end up looking something like this. Brown, mostly uniform, and still soft and pliable. After the doughs have finished kneading, I put them in separate, lightly buttered bowls, cover them with towels, and place them back in the lit oven for another hour, or until they've roughly doubled in size. And it's finally time to make our swirl. I'm keeping the loaf pan in front of me to help guide my rolling and flouring my work surface just enough so that the dough doesn't stick. I don't want to excessively flour it. Starting with the larger plain piece of dough, I'm going to lightly flour the top, again, not excessively, and start pressing it out into a square, which will help me achieve the ideal shape when I start rolling. The goal is to create a somewhat rectangular sheet of dough that is no wider than the length of the loaf pan. It doesn't need to be especially thin, and I'll show you why later, but the thinner the dough, the swirlier the end result will be. Have patience. The dough can be a bit elastic, but keep working it until it is evenly rolled into a large rectangle. Flour it as needed. After that's rolled out, carefully move it aside. It's a very soft dough, so you'll probably need to take care in lifting it. And then repeat the same procedure with the barley layer. Ideally, they'll be the same thickness, but you'll see that I make the barley layer a bit smaller than the plain layer. Once that's also been rolled into an even rectangle, it's time for the final assembly. Very carefully lift the barley layer onto the sheet of plain dough and smooth out any folds or wrinkles. This might be easier and more graceful for you if you have a larger work surface than me, but I'm making it work. I like to gently stretch the layers by hand into a more uniform shape. Then I'm going to roll them together with my pin ever so briefly before rolling the dough into a log. I'm starting from one of the shorter sides and patiently rolling to make sure that the log is nice and tight. Take as much time as is necessary to ensure that it's rolling lengthwise rather than diagonally on accident. Now that it's ready for the loaf pan, make sure that the bottom layer of the log is snug underneath. Lifting it into the pan can be a bit awkward, as you'll see. Just try not to stretch it out or say any of the dirty metaphors going on in your head out loud if you have company. Oh God, here we go. Okay, come on, you can do it. Lift, lift, lift. And it's in. I really thought it was going to be a disaster there for a moment. If you rolled it out well, it should be no longer than the pan, but also able to fit snugly without much pinching or prodding. For the last time, this gets covered with a towel and placed in the oven for an hour until satisfyingly risen. After taking out the pan, preheat the oven to 350 degrees and bake it for 40 minutes, checking about halfway through to see if it's browning so quickly that it needs to be covered in tin foil. After 40 minutes, it should look like this. Brown, beautiful, and wholesome. I specifically wanted to show you this side with the tear because that's what happens when the dough is rolled somewhat thinly, as I mentioned previously. But I also want you to see that it's not a big deal and has essentially no effect on the final product. It's happened to me every time I've made Fette Biscottate and has never really been an issue, so don't worry about it if it happens to you. But now for the bad news. This needs to rest until it's cooled completely, at least overnight, but ideally 18 to 24 hours. I know. Remember I said this wasn't quick? Anyway, I remove it from the pan so that it doesn't form condensation and let it rest in a towel before moving on to the, yes, finally, the last stage, slicing and toasting. If you're anything like me, you're dying to see how those pretty swirls you labored and waited so long for turned out. And this does not disappoint. It's honestly one of my personal best loaves I've ever made. Isn't that so lovely? Look at that. Look at that. So wholesome and beautiful. Just want to look at it all day. But it's time to keep on slicing. And the only thing more satisfying than watching the slicing footage again is having done it in real life. It's just One of life's joys, isn't it? I try not to slice them thicker than half an inch, and even that seems a bit much. Too thick and they're unpleasant to eat, too thin and you risk burning them while toasting. But no matter what you decide, just make sure that the slices are as even as possible so that they toast evenly and don't burn on the edges or not get toasted at all. Now, I don't think that the ends of the loaf work very well as fette biscottate, so I just eat them as a nice snack on their own, and it looks like I got 23 slices. Not a bad yield, not bad at all. And we are nearing the end. It's time to arrange these neatly on a baking sheet and place them in an oven that's been preheated to 300 degrees Fahrenheit for 20 minutes per side, making sure to keep an eye on them toward the end because they can very, very quickly go from this to that. And that's actually up to you. If you want them a little toastier, a little browner, then by all means go for it. I like them to be a bit golden, definitely dehydrated all the way through, but still golden. Notice here how some of the swirls look a bit different. Those are from a previous batch, and I just want you to see how many variations there can be depending on all sorts of variables, and also how the tearing on the loaf had no negative effect whatsoever. Now all that's left to do is enjoy them with a nice cup of coffee, or barley coffee in my case, and top them with whatever you want. I'm using some nice raspberry jam here, but you can use butter, mascarpone, butter and jam, or my favorite, mascarpone and jam. And I had to leave the video sound on here because I want you to hear just how crispy and crunchy these things turn out. They're nice and completely dehydrated, no more softness in there, but the real test is going to be when I take my first big bite. They are toasty, crisp, and ever so slightly sweet, not too sweet at all. And you do taste the barley, but it's not unpleasant. It's really, really nice, I promise you. They can keep for weeks in a paper bag in a cool, dry place, ready for you whenever you want breakfast or just a nice snack. And I know it seems like a lot of time and work for something that's so simple, but making things from scratch, especially things from my memories, always brings me closer to what's important to me in my life, and I hope you feel the same way. Anyway, I hope that you enjoyed this video as much as I enjoyed filming it, and that you found it useful, or even that you're inspired to try making this recipe. Thanks so much.